and welcome to the electronic seminar series on social policy. We're very fortunate to have with us today Professor Michael Noble from the Centre for the Analysis of South African Social Policy at the University of Oxford. Welcome, Michael.
Thank you, Pagama.
Well, what are you going to be talking about today?
I'm going to be talking about multiple deprivation in South Africa, and in particular the geographical distribution of multiple deprivation and how that knowledge can be used to inform policy making.
That sounds really fascinating, Michael. I'll hand over to you then.
Okay, thank you, Pagama. As I said, today I'm going to be talking about multiple deprivation in South Africa. In particular, I'm going to be talking about a project which we recently completed to design an index of multiple deprivation at small area level for South Africa using data from the 2001 census. We undertook this project for the National Department of Social Development, and it was funded by the UK Department for International Development. And the purpose of the index was to enable the National Department to target its anti-poverty programmes, and I'll talk a little bit more about that later in the presentation. It builds on an earlier piece of work which we undertook to design a ward-level index of multiple deprivation at provincial level across the country. And this is a refinement of that. The principles are the same, but the technique is different. I'm going to start by outlining the model of multiple deprivation that underpins the project, give a brief description of the South African Index of Multiple Deprivation and its component domains, talk about domain and indicator issues, and give a brief description of the methodology. I'm then going to conclude by talking about the findings and the possible application of the index and some concluding remarks. The starting point for this index is that deprivation is multidimensional, and that multidimensional deprivation can be conceptualized as a combination of individual dimensions or domains of deprivation. The individual domains must first be carefully defined and identified, and indicators selected for each of the domains which represent the best possible direct measures of that kind of deprivation. And by direct measures we mean that if it's income deprivation, it must be a measure of low income and not of some proxy for low income, such as lack of possession of some item. The indicators are then combined together to create an overall relative measure of that dimension of deprivation. The domains of deprivation that were selected for this index are as follows: income and material deprivation, employment deprivation, health deprivation, education deprivation, and living environment deprivation. I'll talk about each of the different domains of deprivation first, and define the deprivation and indicate the indicators used to measure that deprivation before looking at the methodological techniques employed to generate the overall index of multiple deprivation. First, income and material deprivation. This deprivation aims to capture proportions of a population experiencing income or material deprivation in an area. The numerator for this particular domain of deprivation is that people must be experiencing one or more of the following. Either they must be living in a household that has a household equivalent income below 10,189 rands a year, that's 850 rands a month, or they must be living in a household without a refrigerator, or a household with neither a radio nor a television. And these material possessions were selected because other research that's been undertaken by CASASP has indicated that people think these items are necessities for people in South Africa to enjoy if they're to have an adequate standard of living. So there were particularly selected items to complement the low-income measure. And the denominator for this is the total population. Employment domain seeks to cover people who are excluded from the world of work involuntarily. And that means that we try to capture both the people who are unemployed, but the people who are unable to work through sickness or disability. So the numerator for this is the number of people who are not working in the 7 days prior to the census night, wanted to work and were available for work. This is reflecting the ILO definition of unemployment. Also, it captures people who weren't working because of illness or disability. And the denominator is the total economically active population together with people who are not working because of illness and disability. The health domain specifically aims to capture areas where there are high rates of mortality. And indeed, the indicator we use here is one that's constructed. It's a kind of standardized mortality ratio, but it's called the years of potential life lost. It's an easier to understand expression of mortality than some of the standardized mortality ratios. The education domain tries to capture the extent to which people in the area lack educational qualifications. And for this, the numerator is the number of 18 to 65-year-olds experiencing no schooling at secondary level or above, and the denominator is the number of 18 to 65-year-olds in the population, excluding those in institutions. Finally, the living environment domain aims to identify deprivation relating to the poor quality of the living environment. And here the numerator is people experiencing one or more of the following: either no access to a telephone, or no piped water inside their dwelling or in their yard, or no use of electricity for lighting, or living in houses that are shacks, or living in households without a pit latrine with ventilation or a flush toilet, or living in households with 2 or more persons per room, in other words, overcrowded households. And the denominator is again the total population. Next, I want to talk about some methodological issues. One of the first things that one has to look at in constructing an index of deprivation is to consider whether small numbers become a problem. Because if there are small numbers, you tend to get large standard errors and unreliable scores. And this is particularly important when you're looking at very small areas. To deal with small numbers, we employ a technique known as empirical Bayes shrinkage estimation. And shrinkage estimation moves unreliable scores, in our case, to the municipal mean. In fact, given the extent of poverty and deprivation in South Africa, there's actually not much movement with shrinkage estimation, but one still has to apply the technique to make sure that the scores are as robust as possible. Next, one needs to combine the indicators to create domain scores, and this in all cases except health is a simple proportion. And then finally, one has to combine the domain scores into an overall index of multiple deprivation, and you do this by, first of all, standardizing, then transforming, and then aggregating the transform scores. Now, I'll talk a bit more about the standardization and transformation process now. Okay, first, domain scores have to be standardized, and we do this by simply ranking. We then need to transform the scores, and we use something called the exponential distribution. And we use this because the exponential distribution spreads out the 25% most deprived data zones in the country. And it also eliminates implicit weights and thus controls for cancellation between the domains. Right, now I want to talk a bit about the geography that we use in order to describe deprivation across South Africa. Area deprivation measures should be based on a geography which has areas of relatively small population size, have an even population size between areas, and are relatively homogeneous. This is important to enable pockets of deprivation to be identified and to allow for fair comparisons between areas in different parts of the country. The previous index that I mentioned, the provincial indices of multiple deprivation, used the electoral ward as the geographical unit. Now, the problem with the electoral ward is that it varies greatly in size across the country. Some wards have less than 100 people. There's one ward in the city of Johannesburg with over 80,000 people. The mean population is 11,400, and there's a large standard deviation of nearly 8,000. So you can see very variable geography. It doesn't tick the boxes of being a relatively even population size between areas. It's not that small a population size either, so it's not entirely satisfactory for that. And this weakness, really, of wards meant that the original indices couldn't be a South Africa-wide indices. They had to be done province by province, because actually ward size varies quite a lot by province. Some provinces like the Northern Cape have relatively small wards. Other provinces like Gauteng, big centres of population, have relatively large wards. And so we needed a new statistical geography. And that's where we created data zones. And so let me just pause to tell you a bit about data zones before we move on to actually look at the geography of poverty across South Africa. Now, data zones were designed to fulfil the following requirements, basically. We wanted similar population size across the country of between 1,000 and 3,000, with a target population of 2,000. We wanted to delineate as much as possible natural neighbourhoods and allow pockets of deprivation to be identified. We wanted to maximise on social homogeneity and population density. And we did this by, a sophisticated GIS program that took into account these factors. We wanted to create a manageable geography, placing controls to limit the data zone's size and shape. We didn't want to have large data zones, as I've mentioned, but we also didn't want very oddly shaped data zones. The building blocks for data zones were a census building block called enumeration area, and you could get to even population sized data zones by simply stringing EAs together to form like long sausages or ribbons, and this doesn't tend to reflect natural communities. So we had to impose some rules that in a sense kept data zones roughly circular in shape. We needed them to nest within traditional geographies, and so we decided that they had to nest within municipalities, South African municipalities, and provinces. And finally, they had to form a contiguous geography, and as I said, built from census EAs. So that's the data zones. And what did we end up with? Well, we ended up with 22,164 data zones, and this chart here shows the data zone distribution by province. As you can see, some of the provinces, like KwaZulu-Natal in particular, Gauteng, Eastern Cape, have relatively large numbers of data zones. That's because they have large populations. Others, like the Northern Cape, which is very sparsely populated, have only 417 data zones. Okay, I think enough of the background and methodology. Let's get to the findings. Next thing I want to do is actually show a map of the whole of South Africa and showing multiple deprivation across the whole country. So here's a map of the whole of South Africa. The 22,000 plus data zones have been divided into 10 equal groups. The most deprived data zones have been coloured on this map the darkest shade of blue. The 10% next most deprived, a slightly lighter colour of blue, etc. And the least deprived data zones are actually coloured yellow. And what you can see is a pattern of deprivation across the country that heavily leans towards the Eastern Cape, KwaZulu-Natal, Northwest, Limpopo and so forth. Whereas the yellow or least deprived areas tend to be concentrated in Gauteng and the Western Cape. Now that map may look very familiar to you, because if we actually look at the map of the former homelands from the apartheid era, there you can see a map of the former homelands. And note the location of the former homelands, and in particular the Ciskei, Transkei, the KwaZulu homeland, Bophuthatswana, and parts of Leboa. If we now flip back to the map I just showed you, that's where the blue areas are. And we can drill down at provincial level a bit in a minute, but you can see that I think it's quite dramatic that the most severe deprivation still subsists in the former homeland areas. Okay, if we actually look at deprivation at the province level in a more quantitative way, I'll just show you this table. And this table states both the number of data zones in each province and the number in the 10% most deprived and the 20% most deprived. But it's the two columns at the end that are most important. The percentage of a province's data zones that are in the 10% most deprived in the country, and the percentage of a province's data zones that are in the 20% most deprived. That's referring back to the maps, the two darkest shades of blue, really. So let's look at the 10% most deprived first. Well, 32.6% of the Eastern Cape's data zones are in the 10% most deprived of data zones in the country. And the next is KwaZulu-Natal with 21.3%. None of the other provinces really have that kind of proportion of data zones in of the most deprived data zones. In the Western Cape it's effectively zero, Northern Cape 0, Gauteng 0. If we look at the 20% most deprived, then Eastern Cape's still number one, this time with 49.8%, and KwaZulu-Natal is still number two with 37.1%. And then we get Limpopo with 16.7%, and then Northwest with 15.1%. Okay, having looked at that provincial picture, let's drill down in a couple of exemplar provinces. I'm going to take the Western Cape and the Eastern Cape because they are, in a sense, they're both contiguous, but they're also polar opposites, as you can see from this table. So if we can look at the Western Cape, you'll see that basically you don't see any of the dark blue at all. The top part of that map is the whole of the Western Cape, and this is really part of the city of Cape Town. So we'll just drill down to have a better picture of the whole of the Western Cape. You can see out in some of the rural areas, these green areas. These represent rural farming communities, and there's relatively large amounts of deprivation in there for the Western Cape, though in the absolute national picture they don't figure in either the 10% most deprived or the 20% most deprived. However, the index isn't without its uses even in the Western Cape, because if we drill down now to the city of Cape Town, what you can see within the city of Cape Town are a number of blue areas, not as dark a blue as to put them in the most deprived deciles, but you can see areas around here, around the N2 corridor, which are areas such as Kailicha here, Nyanga here, Langa there, and even down in the peninsula here, we have here Masipumalela. So it's still useful even in the relatively affluent city of Cape Town, because it picks up those pockets of deprivation in the Cape Flats and the townships. Before we move on, let's just give people who are not familiar with this area some kind of insight as to what those areas of deprivation look like. And here's actually a picture of Kailicha to give an example of what the deprivation, as it were, looks like on the ground. And you can see it's informal settlements, shacks, and that's very typical of where in urban settings the most deprived areas are. Okay, so having looked at that, let's now move on to the Eastern Cape. And the Eastern Cape, that's the overall Eastern Cape, and I'm going to drill down quite quickly here. The two inserts at the bottom are respectively Port Elizabeth and East London. And you can see, again, the pockets of deprivation that are familiar within the cities. But that's not what the big picture is in the Eastern Cape at all. Whereas the big picture in the Western Cape was urban deprivation, a little bit of rural deprivation in the farmlands, but the deepest deprivation in the urban townships. That's not the message of the Eastern Cape. What you see in the Eastern Cape is deep deprivation in the former homeland areas. And we'll go on to remind you actually of the map of the former homelands, this time focus just down on the former homelands of the Ciskei and the Transkei, and then go back to this map again. There you go, Transkei, Ciskei. I think it's very, very striking there. And here's the sort of, if you like, the look of rural poverty. This is a scene from actually part of the former Ciskei. What you'll find there is people living without access to electricity, largely without access to water, and with little or no access to jobs. That's really a flavour, if you like, of the patterns of deprivation across South Africa. Let's now look at possible uses. I think there are several possible uses of the SAIMD. It's, as I said, a recently completed project, so it hasn't been used in earnest yet, but its predecessor, the provincial indices of multiple deprivation, have been used in South Africa. And so we know that the SAIMD will be effective in targeting anti-poverty programs and resources. You can see where the deepest deprivation is if you have area-based initiatives or particular programs to tackle poverty. You can use these data in order to target the poverty. You can use it to identify areas to promote take-up of social grants. And in fact, the provincial indices of multiple deprivation have been used in that way in the past. It's clear that if you have an indication of where low income is distributed, then the eligibility to social grants is likely to be in those places. So you can use it to promote take-up. You can use it to identify areas to improve service delivery. A lot of, for example, what I was talking about in terms of the deep rural poverty in the Eastern Cape is there. The people don't have access to water, they don't have access to sanitation, they don't have access to electricity. These data will enable people, municipalities and central and provincial government to identify areas to prioritise to put in these services. And as an academic use too, because if one's actually looking at selecting areas for research, to actually research particular aspects of poverty, then you can use these indices to target that research. Okay, well, Conclusions. The conclusions here are, for me, very stark and clear, that most deprived data zones overwhelmingly map onto the former homeland areas, most notably the former Transkei and the former Ciskei in the Eastern Cape and the former KwaZulu homeland in KwaZulu-Natal, but also the homeland areas in Limpopo, the Northwest, Mpumalanga and so forth. But there's still a strength in the data zone geography in that it enables very small pockets of deprivation to be picked up in otherwise affluent areas. And we've seen particularly graphic examples within the city of Cape Town, Langa, Nyanga, Crossroads, Imizamo, Yetu, Masiphumelele, Khayelitsha. But if I'd have shown you Gauteng and the city of Joburg, it would have picked up Orange Farm, Lenasia, parts of Alexandria, parts but not all of Soweto, and I could go on. But I think that gives a picture of deprivation in South Africa and the possible uses that this index can be put to. Thank you, and that concludes what I wanted to present today.
Thank you very much, Michael. This has been a very fascinating seminar, and I thought it was particularly informative that the former homelands have the highest rate of deprivation. You mentioned that the South African Index of Multiple Deprivation, or any index of multiple deprivation, is composed of several domains. Could you tell us a little bit more about how these domains relate to each other, or if they can be used separately for policy purposes?
Okay, yes, certainly. Each of the domains, the income and material deprivation domain, the employment domain, health domain, education domain, living environment domain, are all usable as separate indices. And indeed, that's the design, that you could actually use the single deprivation indices as well as the multiple deprivation index. They relate to each other in the following way. I mean, they are actually some of them quite closely correlated. So you will find correlation coefficients of around 0.9 as between, for example, income and living environment, and indeed education. Some actually correlate less well. So surprisingly, employment and low income correlate only about 0.7, which is less than, for example, indices elsewhere. And that's because sometimes in some parts of South Africa, people in employment are on very low incomes. So people are, so to speak, earning their poverty. And that doesn't happen as much, certainly in, for example, developed countries, where there's a much closer correlation between income and employment. So the fact that each of these domains means something different and is not necessarily highly correlated, but even when they are highly correlated, they will in particular areas not be particularly closely related. It means that the individual domains of deprivation do have value in their own right. And if you're, for example, a policymaker who is interested in targeting help towards, for example, adult education, you could use the education domain to identify those areas where there's particular deficits in people completing secondary schooling, for example. And you could design a targeted lifelong learning or higher education, further education, I should say, and policy. So that would be an example of where you could use just a specific domain. You wouldn't need to use the overall index, right. You would just use that particular domain. And the one I actually mentioned in the talk about targeting areas for take-up of social grants. Well, social grants are means tested, and so actually the income domain would be more appropriate than using the overall index of multiple deprivation. On the contrary, if you were trying to improve services, you would tend to use the living environment domain on its own. It's only when you want to get a general measure of multiple deprivation you would use the overall index.
Right. Thank you. That's very informative, Michael. The indices provide a picture of deprivation by comparing areas relative to other areas. Yeah. Is it possible to identify proportions of people in relation to the particular deprivation that they experience?
Yes. You mean just working out the actually percentage of people in a particular area that are income deprived or something like that?
Yes.
Yeah. No, absolutely you can, and indeed in the published data tells us that at individual data zone level. So what you will know from looking at the data sets is that 100% of the population in a particular data zone is income deprived, but only 20% of another. And there is wide variation because clearly, even if you look at province level, whereas provincial levels of income deprivation, just focusing on that, are as high as 80+% in areas like the Eastern Cape and Limpopo, whereas if you look at the Western Cape, you're down to about 50%. And with individual data zones, there's a much bigger variation, and there are a number of data zones in certain of the most deprived provinces where all of the people are income deprived and all of the people are living environment deprived. Yeah.
Have these indices been developed anywhere else internationally? And if so, could you give us a few examples of how they've been used by governments for policy purposes?
For sure. I mean, originally, one of the research centres that I direct, the Social Disadvantage Research Centre, developed indices of multiple deprivation for the different countries in the UK, starting with England, but also doing Wales, Scotland, Northern Ireland, and then England again, and then England again. So we've got quite a lot of experience of developing these indices for use within the UK. And within the UK, just take England for example, they're used in many different ways. I mean, the overall index of multiple deprivation is used to assist the departments of communities and local government in target what it calls areas for neighbourhood regeneration, and in particular to reduce worklessness in those areas, to improve educational attainment and improve the built environment and so forth. And they use the English index of multiple deprivation in order to identify the areas to target. But more than that, they actually use the index to channel resources to local authorities to tackle deprivation. And then in other ways it's used too, because the National Health Service funding formula actually incorporates parts of the index of multiple deprivation, no, not the overall index, some of the individual domain indices. It utilises those within the National Health Service funding formula so that NHS resources are targeted at deprived areas. And I mean, someone has actually at some point computed that something like £60 billion, I mean, maths is not good enough to tell you how many rands that is, of resources are targeted using the English index, for example.
Wow, really?
Yeah, so yeah, and they've been used. I mean, they are being developed in other countries too. There's a scoping study been undertaken for Bangladesh, and I'm also on an advisory panel that's advising the Australian government on, an Australian university who's for the Australian government producing an index of multiple deprivation for Australia. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Oh, thank you, Michael. That's really informative. And that concludes our seminar on the South African Index of Multiple Deprivation. Thank you.